So good afternoon from Scotland and the rest of the UK. Welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Alex Humphreys and I'll help manage the discussion today. Also from the Asia Scotland Institute is Roddy Gow, Chairman and Founder. This webinar will be an opportunity to pay tribute to the longest serving Prime Minister in Japanese history, following his tragic assassination earlier this year. We'll also delve into his profound and complex legacy. Joining us today on our panel is Govinda Finn, economics lecturer at Kobe University, Professor Chris Hughes, professor in international politics and Japanese studies at PIS and Pro-Vice Chancellor. Also joining us is Professor Shihiko Hirakawa at the Center of International Education and lecturer at Graduate School of Asia-Pacific Studies. Also joining us is Sir David Warren, former British ambassador to Japan, and Tobias Harris, analyst and author. For attendees today, you should know that we're on the Zoom webinar platform, so your videos and microphones cannot be displayed or heard, and only panelists can be seen. Please raise any questions by the Zoom Q&A function, either privately to me or publicly to the group if you wish. If there are any particular questions you'd like addressed to a particular speaker, then please address them at the beginning. Without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Roddy to get going. Thank you.
Alex, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists who are on. We have a very distinguished group who are going to help us look at Japan from the outside as she is perceived and also from the inside. I'm also very grateful to obviously Sir David Warren for joining us, who has a distinguished knowledge of Japan and of Mr. Abe, to Tobias Harris, who of course is the author of the book, the great book, The Iconoclast, which gives an extremely interesting view of Abe, to Professor Chris Hughes from Warwick, to Professor Hirakawa, who is joining us from Japan, and of course to Govinda Finn, who, in the event there's a breakdown in communications, will leap into the breach from Japan where he is. So this is an extraordinary moment to be thinking about the legacy of Prime Minister Abe and where things may go looking forward, coming as it does shortly after the state funeral that was held to recognize his existence as one of the longest serving prime ministers in Japanese history. And although there may have been some controversy, the point of this webinar is to focus on Japan now and what Abe has achieved for Japan. And so, Sir David, I wonder if I could start with you by asking you to reflect on Prime Minister Abe and his legacy.
Thank you very much, Roddy, and I hope everybody can hear me clearly. And thank you for inviting me to take part in this webinar today on such a distinguished panel. I have to recognize there are many more experts around the room today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them. A brief overview of Prime Minister Abe's legacy, and as you say, it is a complex one. And made more complex perhaps by the tragic circumstances of his assassination a couple of months ago, which shocked us all. I suppose the most important thing I would want to register to start with, was the stability that Prime Minister Abe was able to bring to Japanese politics after a period of intense instability, a famously revolving door of Japanese premiers going back over many decades, marked by some periods of longevity, yes, Nakasone, Koizumi, and so forth, and others further back than that, but basically a very febrile, very volatile political environment, made more so by the chaotic and disastrous 3 years of the Democratic Party of Japan's administration from 2009 to 2012, which was when I was ambassador. And indeed, you kindly said I knew Prime Minister Abe. In fact, I met him on a few occasions, but I'd left Japan by the time he became Prime Minister in 2012. Abe brought real stability to Japanese politics, and that was a formidable achievement. And he did a number of things which were extremely important during his premiership. I suppose, firstly, he managed the relationship with the United States very well, and particularly the extraordinarily difficult process of managing the relations with President Trump after 2016. The Japanese put an enormous amount of effort into trying to understand and manage, if not control, this very unpredictable, mercurial, and difficult president in a relationship which remains existential for the Japanese in terms of the security and defense alliance, and which is at the heart of Japanese international relations. And given that they were two very, very different men, that their temperaments and assumptions, and I think also maybe their politics, but we can talk about that, were extraordinarily divergent, I think Prime Minister Abe deserves great credit for the skill and diplomacy with which he managed this extraordinarily difficult, and indeed one may say destructive political leader. And at the same time, managed that relationship in ways that enabled Japan to compensate for some of the destructive impulses that came from the US administration during that period, and particularly the way in which Japan resuscitated what was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, became the CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade investment arrangement among Asia-Pacific countries, from which President Trump withdrew very early on in his administration, and which the Japanese government, with great skill and determination, were able to piece together that partnership and make it a going concern. Indeed, a concern which has begun to bring in countries outside the immediate region, like the United Kingdom, in its attempts to build new trade relationships around the world. That was a formidable diplomatic achievement of the Abe administration, and it underpinned, in the economic field, to a degree, the other successful area of Abe's administration, which was to institutionalize security relationships, not just with the United States, under the threat of Trump's America First rhetoric, which looked very critically at its defense commitments around the world, but to bring a more institutional defense and security set of relationships, firstly in the Pacific with Australia and India, the so-called security diamond, which Abe had written about in many years before he became prime minister, indeed, at the time of his first administration, back in the decade before last, but also beginning to institutionalize security relationships with NATO, with France, and with the United Kingdom. That was a considerable achievement, given that Abe was not able to push ahead with his proposed reform to the Constitution to remove Japan's ostensible pacifism from Article 9, nor indeed did Abe, unlike Koizumi, nor indeed did he deploy forces overseas on international activities as Koizumi did in Afghanistan, albeit not in combat, and Abe did not in the Afghanistan theatre or indeed in the war against Daesh. So Abe, I think, deserves credit, we think in those terms, in terms of his legacy, for the way in which, as he said when he became prime minister, he brought Japan back into the forefront of international consideration in these areas. But there were failures in foreign policy. The attempt through 27, I think it was, meetings with Vladimir Putin to get some movement on the contested Northern Islands got nowhere. And Abe's residual nationalism, which we need to talk about in this webinar, stood in the way of any successful attempt to detoxify the increasingly difficult relationships with the Republic of Korea. There are different views about Abe's nationalism. My own view, and I put this in a paper at Chatham House, for Chatham House in 2015, was that Abe, given that he came from a very nationalist direction in terms of his family, in terms of his traditional political views, was able, with reasonable skill, to navigate the test of a statement on the 70th anniversary of the end of the war that both reflected Japan's apologies for the conflict enunciated by previous prime ministers and at the same time turned the page in terms which with which Abe himself, I think personally, was more comfortable, without seriously alienating Asian neighbors. This is an extraordinarily complex process which would take more than 1 hour of a webinar, I think, to explain in detail. But I think that Abe can be that statement as it emerged can be considered reasonably successful, or at least not contentious to a degree that was destabilizing. But there is no doubt that this residual nationalism stood in the way of any serious hope of improving relations with the Republic of Korea. There may be faults on both sides in that instance, but it was a source of profound frustration to the United States that its two major allies in the Asia-Pacific region should remain at loggerheads so bitterly during this period. And Abe's own tendency to want, whenever he could, to pay the sort of respects to the nationalist tradition, the Yasukuni Shrine, and his grandfather's legacy, I think was part of that. A word on the economy. Abenomics was, in a sense, more of a political statement than an economic strategy, but it did stabilize the Japanese economy after a period of uncertainty. It boosted portfolio investment in the Japanese stock market. It saw big fiscal interventions, perhaps which were negated to a degree by the consumption tax hikes. So there may be accusations of mixed messages there. And it saw the beginnings of some serious structural reform, which I think appealed to investors, not least in the governance of listed companies on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. The womenomics, as it was called, bringing women back into the workforce, a greater emphasis on diversity. One should not, I think, overplay all these areas. There is considerable work still to do, but it was a signature policy which nonetheless saw some movement and some stabilizing of the situation, although since then, for a variety of reasons, which I think we're going to be able to talk about, Japan has begun to suffer both from radical depreciation of the yen against a surging dollar, and also from the inflation which the Bank of Japan has been trying to create for the last, I don't know how many decades, but caused more by import, the appreciation of imports with a declining yen rather than the sort of wage hikes which I think Japanese politicians have wanted to see.
So David, thank you. David, thank you very much. Mindful of the time, I'm going to ask Govinda if he could now comment on some aspects of domestic side, but thank you so much for those comments. Very helpful. Govinda.
Thank you, Roddy. Thank you, Alex, and thank you to the team for the opportunity to speak to you all. I will carry on the narrative that Sir David so kindly set up, and I think my main job today is to dig a little deeper into Abe's domestic policy agenda. So I am based in Japan, and I watched the state funeral earlier this week with my two sons. Of course, it was a very somber occasion and impeccably observed throughout. But two things struck me. So first was a speech by the current Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida. So he recalled Abe's own words, and I quote, "A Prime Minister is not a metal casting that can be made by simply pouring molten iron into a mold, but one of forged metal, which takes its shape by being struck time and time again." Kishida's portrayed Abe as not only a great Japanese leader, but also someone who was molded by experience, someone defined as much by his defeats as by his successes. The idea that Abe was flexible, a pragmatist, and not some ideologue is an important one, and I'd like to return to that topic later. The second observation I will make was how difficult it was to explain Abe's importance to my sons. Abe certainly has an extensive agenda of change, but there were few blockbuster successes. On the plus side, I am well prepped for difficult questions, so feel free to submit your questions on chat or by flagging to Alex. Okay, so let's start with the easy topic. What were Abe's achievements at home? What impact did they have, and why do they continue to be so divisive? So let's begin with Abenomics, a combination of monetary, fiscal, and structural reforms, neatly described by the 3 policy arrows. Were they successful? Critics point out Abenomics was not able to deliver on explicit promises. The dual goals of 2% economic growth and 2% inflation remained unfulfilled. But is that sufficient evidence to discredit them? I think that depends on the reasons for the failure. So today I'll offer 2 benign explanations and 1 malignant explanation. The first issue was bad advice. In conventional thinking, crisis or even depression or recession are painful, but they lay the groundwork for economic recovery. Abenomics challenged the de facto thinking that a more severe crisis or depression is a necessary condition to wean out zombie firms and implement meaningful economic change. Instead, Abe's stimulus policy was designed to provide positive demand momentum that would lift growth expectations and create a virtuous circle. A kind of do-it-all-at-once policy. While the implementation was quite successful, Japan certainly did not experience a rise in borrowing costs that we've seen in the UK this week. Growth expectations in Japan are below the level before Abe came into power today and have been falling for much of the decade. So the limited effectiveness of Abe's reform in an economy propped up by government-generated demand and the absence of the forces of creative destruction is the first novel feature we need to wrestle with in assessing Abenomics. The second explanation for Abenomics' failure to meet its target is that critical supply-side measures such as structural reforms take time. Critics point to a failure to boost the dynamism of the Japanese economy. This led to what the Bank of Japan describes as an excessive saving mindset among firms, with cash holdings recently reaching 250 trillion yen. That's cash that's equivalent to the economy the size of Canada. What does large cash holdings mean? Well, it could mean that Japanese firms are financially sound and a safe investment. However, it's also true that a large amount of funds are held in near zero interest rates deposits, leading to sluggish returns on equity and poor stock returns. And it's not just low returns, it's bad for growth. Cash could be more productively used if it was distributed to employees through wages or used to expand productive capabilities or to pay dividends to shareholders. Despite criticism of the third arrow policies to get to grip with problems like inefficient labour and capital allocation, there has been some important successes. Take, for example, the introduction of the 2014 Stewardship Code and the 2015 Corporate Governance Code. These were designed to tackle mismanagement of corporate balance sheets by corporate leaders. We're seeing real momentum in this area, and there's concrete evidence that it is paying off. Return on equity has nearly doubled to 10% compared to when Abe came to power. Of course, it's not entirely stopped the cash accumulation, but I think we will see those cash accumulation come down with continued investor support and a little patience. The final explanation is slightly more concerning. Abe was accused of being uncommitted to reforms, or worse, feigning interest in economics to garner political capital to pursue his real passion, constitutional reform. A good example, which Sir David mentioned, was so-called womenomics. Abe set a target of filling 30% of leadership positions with Japanese women, but according to the World Economic Federation Forum, the ratio of female managers overall has increased to just 9%. Equally disappointing, Abe was accused of wasting political capital on attempts to reform Japan's pacifist constitution while ignoring issues that were vital to the Japanese people. For example, inequality and redistribution policy, and in the environment and sustainability policy. So with my remaining time, I'd like to address an important question about whether Abe was truly committed to his reforms, and ultimately whether he changed Japan forever. As Sir David points out, it is difficult to talk about Abe without considering his heritage. He was a political blue blood, groomed for power, but his emergence on the political scene, while inevitable, was not the path most likely. In fact, he was the chosen successor of a politician, Junichiro Koizumi, that had been at war with his more conservative parts of his party for most of his career. But Abe inherited Koizumi's reformist zeal. Yes, he was cut from a very different cloth than from other reforming politicians. Margaret Thatcher's father, for example, owned a grocery shop in Grantham in Lincolnshire. Gerhard Schroeder began his career in a hardware shop in the North Rhine. In comparison, Abe's grandfather had been prime minister and his father had been the foreign minister. This led some to argue Abe's reformist zeal was simply opportunistic. But I think we should be careful about interpreting him as having been a covert defender of the status quo. Let me end by returning to Prime Minister Kishida's speech, in which he pledged to use the foundations Abe laid to build a new Japan. I believe this was said in earnest. Abe's character will remain controversial. However, his economic policies will cast a shadow over the domestic political arena for many years to come. So
thank you very much indeed for that very clear expose. And we'll now pass the baton to Professor Chris Hughes in Warwick to take us on from there. Chris.
Thanks, Roddy. Yeah, I'll try and be brief. How did Abe Shinzo change Japan forever? So my speciality is in Japan's foreign security policy, so I'll talk about that and pick up on some of the themes that Ambassador Warren touched upon. So my reaction to the question, to that statement, is simply that Abe came to exercise a leadership that enabled him to capitalize on a number of trends that were already building in Japan prior to his premiership. But he managed to crystallize those and galvanize those forces. And what he did is fundamentally he shifted Japan onto a new and I think a long-term trajectory in its national foreign security policy, and this has continued on his successors. So, his legacy is fundamental, and it will carry on after him. So this is why he's such a consequential figure. More specifically, what I've written about is that I believe that Abe switched Japan from the previous post-war track of the so-called Yoshida Doctrine, named after the very famous post-war Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And that doctrine really was seen to dominate post-war Japanese foreign security policy. But he shifted it onto what we can now call is an eponymous Abe Doctrine. I think it's so significant that we can actually name it after him in terms of a new course in Japanese foreign security policy. This is fundamental. But many achievements for Japan's foreign security policy, but also a mixed impact in some ways. So successes, but also some things which I think are also going to perhaps hamper Japan in the future. And I'll touch upon those very quickly. So what was the Abe Doctrine and how did it actually change Japan's trajectory? So I think a number of colleagues have touched upon this, but essentially Abe, we may disagree about how ideologically he was, but certainly one of the things he did detest, I think, was very much the post-war order that was built under Yoshida, because it was a post-war order of defeat. He saw Japan essentially still for 50, 60 years living under a regime that was really developed through the experience of defeat in wartime, and Japan was still lacking ambition in its international relations and was a small Japan. And the Yoshida Doctrine was something which really just perpetuated that and meant that Japan could not become a tier one nation again. So the Yoshida Doctrine and that post-war regime really had to be swept away. And I think the Abe doctrine had three key kind of characteristics, which I'll just very briefly touch upon. So firstly, the shift from the more sort of minimal defense posture that Yoshida put in place in the post-war period to becoming much more, for Japan to gradually become much more robust and assertive military power. And Ambassador Warren has talked about some of those, I think some of those institutional changes in Japan, National Security Council establishment, national security strategy, and so on, reforms to the Japan self-defense forces become more joint and capable, and also the beginnings of an upturn in Japanese defense spending, which of course where Japan is debating now where to go on that. And also putting in some very interesting debates, which of course he didn't complete in time in his period in the premiership, but for the first time Japan talking about, well, not talking about, actually beginning to build into doctrine, its doctrine, one of counter-strike capability. So Japan's ability not just simply to defend itself through missile defenses, but also to strike back if necessary. Second key feature of the Yoshida, of the Abe doctrine was, again, Ambassador Warren's talked about this, but really a shift from how Japan managed the US-Japan alliance, which is indeed at the core of everything that Japan does in its international relations. So a move from the Yoshida doctrine's rather sort of minimalist stance, do as little as you can in order to keep US-Japan on side and to hedge and to be rather non-committal in your relationship to the United States, to now a much more expanded alliance role, cessation of hedging, integration of Japanese military forces into US strategy, into US operational doctrine on the ground, in the attempt to make Japan a much more equal strategic partner with the United States and to try and influence US behavior in the way that Ambassador Warren talked about Abe's dealings with Trump. And some very important reforms like the 2015 revision of the US-Japan defense guidelines. So Japanese cooperation can now be seamless and global in supporting the United States. Constitutional reinterpretation for collective self-defense. So Abe didn't succeed in formal constitutional revision, but he did succeed in reinterpretation, which I think is much more important because it meant that Japan could now potentially enter into combat operations alongside the United States under certain conditions. And as I've mentioned, I can talk about later if you like, but the integration of a lot of Japanese capabilities with those of the United States for the first time across various domains. And of course, very interestingly, Abe beginning to inch Japan towards thinking about what to do in a Taiwan contingency. Again, we're seeing that very active debate which Abe initiated right now. And then finally, in terms of regional leadership, thinking about how to deal with China, I think a shift from the sort of past leadership from behind in the Asia Pacific that Japan used to exercise and really looking to engage China as a sort of default option to now a much more selective engagement with China, in certain cases an encirclement of China, and certainly willing to talk, always seeking to talk to China, but to talk to China from a position of strength, and also trying to really activate overt Japanese regional leadership. And again, Ambassador Warren has talked about the sort of trade deals that Abe pursued, which is a very important feature of Japanese statecraft, but also things like the quadrilateral security dialogue, and of course, the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which again is a very important feature, I think, which has given a lot of dynamism to Japanese foreign security policy, and also started to influence even the United States thinking about an Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think many successes.
Chris, I'm going to stop you there because you're leading us beautifully into Professor Hirakawa's sector,
okay,
Japan and Japan's role within Asia. But thank you very much for those comments. And Professor Hirakawa, if you could unmute, and we'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So today I'm so honored to participate in such a wonderful event commemorating our former Prime Minister Abe. And in my presentation, not presentation, actually my speech, I'd like to talk about mainly Prime Minister Abe's personality dimension and his foreign policy and diplomatic achievement. And I think Abe was a very natural and destined political leader in Japan's history. Actually, he himself often said always that history judge politicians' reputation and achievement. And I feel so good timing. We had a Prime Minister Abe when Japanese people were most damaged physically and psychologically by the Great East Japan earthquake. So Abe encouraged Japanese people with very innocent and straight and human personality. He did not hide his emotions. It's rather rare for Japanese, actually. And also with his very elite political family background, and he was brought up with a sense of responsibility for very fundamental states visions or world order. So he was never shy to speak out international order making. That's also very rare for Japanese traditional politicians. So I said Abe's very frank personality, but at the same time, he was a very strategic and professional, even sometimes crafty politicians. So that's why various world leaders respected him, I think. And Abe identified himself as a very fighting politician. So Abe's strong political style often divided the reputation among Japanese for and against domestically. But such a very strong and confident style rather well fit to real politics in international arena, especially amidst a very dynamic power shifting era. So in very uncertain international environment, I think Abe was able to sit in the center of Asian Pacific regional order making. And he was, he became finally a diplomatic advisor to Trump. And also on the other hand, Abe persistently continued to pay some respect to Xi Jinping. Even though Xi Jinping was a growing dictator, Abe was very patient. And even he thought if China's internal politics became stable, it's more chance to negotiate with Xi Jinping. Because Xi's power is strong, it automatically means that Xi Jinping's political rival faded out. So negotiating partner should be Xi Jinping only. Okay, so I think such Abe's very flexible acceptance of others and personal ability and some unusual attraction for Japanese were very, very impressive. And I think the year 2018 was a kind of a peak of Abe diplomacy. In 2018, Japan took initiative and successfully concluded TPP-11. That's a very famous topic. But in addition, in Asia Pacific region, I can find some strategic compromise which Abe arranged quietly and successfully. First, Japan and China relationship improved. Japan and China launched a new cooperation scheme of Japan-China cooperation in the third market. So it is kind of Japan's indirect participation in China's Belt and Road Initiative. At the same time, Japanese government modified FOIP, FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific concept from strategy to vision, just a vision. So formerly, FOIP was FOIPS, F-O-I-P-S, but in 2018 fall, the Japanese government rather quietly removed the last S of strategy. And FOIP became just the international public goods, which can even include China. So this change, modification was clearly had on the purpose of not stimulating China, still to accommodate China And further, Abe was thinking to influence China with such engagement. And this decision was also very good for ASEAN, which is also struggling with the dilemma between the US and China. So Japan successfully persuaded ASEAN to accept or use the notion of Indo-Pacific for the first time in ASEAN-Japan document in 2018 fall. And actually next year, ASEAN announced their own version of Indo-Pacific. That is ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. And Abe was really hoping that the Indo-Pacific vision should be ASEAN-centric architecture, not by Japan, not by China, of course China, but ASEAN-centric architecture. And Japan, from the behind, supports such ASEAN's initiative. And also at the same time, Abe started to organize a Quad meeting at SOM level still, relatively low profile. So, and Quad meeting also supported ASEAN-centric architecture. So this is for Japan, is it a very successful regional vision, ASEAN-centric architecture, which include both China and the United States and Japan, extra regional countries. So interestingly, these things simultaneously happened when the United States Vice President Pence made a speech with anti-China flavor. Yet at that time, there was no obvious political friction between the United States and Japan, even though the two countries took a different approach to China. So thus, Abe tried to proactively establish a new regional order by propagating a new concept of Indo-Pacific with very good balance with a comprehensive eyes.
Professor Hirakawa, I'm going to ask you just to stop there because I want to bring Tobias Harris in. We're moving into an area that he has a view on. And then in the Q&A later, we will come back to the subjects that you and others have raised. So thank you very much indeed for that contribution. Thank you. Tobias, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Roddy, and thank you to the Asia Scotland Institute. This has really been a phenomenal discussion, and I have the, I think, unenviable task of trying to pull together a lot of threads, and we've heard a lot, and it speaks to just, I mean, by virtue of having been prime minister the second time for almost 8 years, how busy, how activist he was. And I want to step back, though, to try to wrap up and lead into discussion, you know, really trying to think about Abe's place in sort of the longer sweep of Japanese history and post-war Japanese history, because I think above all else, Abe was always conscious, I think, of his place in the stream of time, you know, that he, you know, coming from a very distinguished Japanese political family, you know, clearly, I think, felt the weight of of his grandfather's legacy, his grandfather's achievements, and lack of achievements in some cases, and some of the failures that his grandfather encountered as prime minister. And I would also add that I think his sense of history actually extended further back into the past. By being from Yamaguchi Prefecture, which of course had been Choshu during the Meiji Restoration, you know, he was someone who was very conscious of how Japan became a modern state, kind of the realist underpinnings of the Meiji Restoration, and what the Meiji leaders who came from the same part of the country that his family came from did to make Japan a great power that could survive in an increasingly threatening global environment. I think he took that to heart, you know, quite strongly, and I think it very much shaped his political identity and the kind of leader he wanted to be. And I think also the fact, you know, part of, we talk about his his admiration for his grandfather and what his grandfather did, and sort of the problematic parts of that. But I think if you read Abe's own words about that, part of his admiration for his grandfather is when his grandfather's generation, that his grandfather was born in, you know, Yamaguchi Prefecture in the former Choshu in the 1890s, you know, was sort of this peak Meiji generation. And Abe talks about the respect he had, or sort of the admiration. Here was a generation that felt like it could take on the world, which maybe not always for the best, but still, that they felt confident they were part of a country that was growing stronger, that felt it was sort of finding its rightful place in the world. And I think Abe, coming from a generation, of course, post-war, having watched Japan defeated and occupied, and still experiencing the constraints of that for decades afterwards. And then, of course, by the time Abe enters politics in the early 1990s, the high-speed growth period is long gone. Japan now, is entering a period of economic stagnation. It's a little lost after the end of the Cold War, and I think all of that I think fueled his admiration for his grandfather as much as anything about what his grandfather wanted to achieve. It's the sense of reclaiming that sense of confidence, that sense of pride, and that was what Abe constantly, the word pride would constantly in his rhetoric throughout his career, doing whatever he could to make Japanese feel proud of their country again and feeling like they could do anything domestically or in the world. And so a lot of that, all of the sort of goals, all the things that he's done that we've already heard about today, all of that was fueled by this understanding that I think came from watching his grandfather's life and career. So again, thinking about Abe and sort of the arc of history, I mean, I think if we look over the course of his 30-year career, not just at what he did during his premiership, and this touches a bit on what Professor Hughes talked about, but I think it's bigger than just leaving behind the Yoshida Doctrine as a foreign policy doctrine. But overall, I mean, I think if we look at what Abe had wanted to achieve, it really was what he said in 2006, leaving behind the post-war regime, leaving behind this idea that Japan had to be restrained, still constricted by the reforms, starting with the Constitution imposed at the end of the war by the U.S. occupation, and by with the help of of Japanese politicians like Yoshida and some of his acolytes, that it was time to leave that behind. That with the end of the Cold War, Japan had a new opportunity to set aside those constraints and to become a proper great power, and that also means having a strong state. So that a lot of the restrictions and a lot of the political system that emerged after 1945 was as much about just restraining power domestically. That of course you had quite understandably a backlash to the kind of authoritarianism that you saw during the 30s and 40s, and so you had a number of constraints that were put in place to prevent that kind of concentration of power. And what we've seen over the arc, really since Abe entered politics, and Abe was not alone in pursuing this, was an attempt to build a stronger state, more top-down leadership, a government that could really be activist, that could really set a direction, that would not be limited in a number of different ways. And I think, Abe, maybe more than anyone else, showed how that power could work. I mean, he wasn't necessarily the one who introduced the administrative reforms of the 1990s. I mean, that was, of course, Hashimoto, and Koizumi did his part with reforms. But Abe both added to those reforms. We could talk about the Cabinet Personnel Bureau, the creation of the National Security Secretariat, a number of other changes to how the LDP functioned, making the LDP a much more top-down, ideologically coherent institution. But then, by virtue of having been in power for so long, Abe really showed what an activist leadership with these new tools, with this sort of more cohesive ideological ruling party, what you could do. And it sort of made for a more majoritarian political system, less based on consensus. And I should add, if you want to know why we saw so much controversy around the funeral, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of these post-war institutions remained popular, particularly among older Japanese. This was not, Abe was not forging a new consensus. I mean, he was sort of in some ways dragging many Japanese into a new era of government, a new style of governance. And it was something that many of his countrymen were not necessarily keen to do. And I think we can't overlook that. We have to acknowledge that this was not necessarily popular, but I don't think there's any question that ultimately he was successful. That I think the Japanese state is irreversibly changed. That Japanese politics, the Japanese government are going to continue to work in ways that look very different than they did even before the start of his government, but certainly compared to the start of his career in the early 1990s. And that is the reality. That Prime Minister Suga and now Prime Minister Kishida have had tools at their disposal in economic policy and foreign and security policy that were just not available to prime ministers during the past. And I think, as we've discussed this morning, there are a number of issues that I think were left unresolved by Abe, but I think his successors now have those tools to confront the challenges of the 21st century. And ultimately, that was what Abe was very clear that he wanted. He wanted a government that could face those challenges head on, that could formulate policies in a coherent way, that could actually implement, and that that's where Abe has, I think, left Japan. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Tobias, thanks. I can't help but resist to quote you from your book, where you write, this book is the story of Abe Shinzo's place in history. Abe, the latest in a long line of Japanese leaders seeking a restoration for their own times, will be remembered for having girded Japan for global competition. Yet his legacy, as you said, will be increasingly shaped by missed opportunities and postponed decisions to tackle the quote unquote troubles at home and dangers from abroad that beset Japan in the 21st century. So that suggests some missed opportunities there. But thank you very much for your comments. Sir David, I wonder if I could ask you, as we started off with you, just to reflect on what Tobias and the others have said, and I will involve other panelists as well. So others, please jump in if you wish. David.
Thank you, Roddy, and thank you to everybody. And a brief reflection on Tobias's words, and I really do defer to him because he is the author of the biography and an expert on Abe in much more detail than I am. And I think he is right that his institutional changes and the way in which he turned the machinery of the Japanese government behind his political objectives, and the way in which, as Tobias has described, he enshrined a new political and administrative approach to the issues which he believed had held Japan back previously in terms of its part atonement for the past, I think is correct. But I think it's important for us to reflect in this webinar, which maybe we haven't quite done, is that he remained, Tobias touched on this more than I did, he remained a divisive politician. I mean, the controversy over the state funeral is significant, I think, and it's partly because of a concern about the Unification Church and the LDP, and there is a long-standing coolness, I think, in Japan when politics and religion, particularly what may be seen as problematical religious movements, become mixed. But it's also that Abe was himself a divisive figure. I mean, Tobias said, he was turning over an awful lot of established nostrums which were of concern to many people of an older generation. He was politically successful in the sense that he went on winning elections, but he won them on the whole on pretty low turnouts. I stand to be corrected, but I think the turnout went down each time that the elections were held. And he won them, as the LDP has often won them, against pretty nugatory opposition, because the opposition parties, whether of the left or right, we can call them by those political names, were pretty chaotic and divided and unable to provide a great deal of resistance to the LDP juggernaut. So I think it's worth just reflecting, without taking away any of the achievements which we've, I think, correctly addressed, and the psychological shift which Abe enshrined, which I agree with, that there is still a residue there of resistance and reserve. And I think maybe we will see less of that under more emollient, more centrist figure like Kishida, although it's interesting that Kishida's own popularity rating, partly because of the taint with the Unification Church and the state funeral issue, does seem to be now in decline. Maybe there is something structural there that we need to reflect in our understanding of Japanese politics.
David, thank you. Govinda, I wonder if I could just ask you to reflect also on the shock of the assassination. We haven't talked about this, but this is a hugely uncharacteristic situation in Japan, that someone to have been shot with a gun, not unfortunately so in the United States.
Yeah, thanks for that, Roddy. So I think there's a number of ways of approaching this issue. Perhaps the most basic is to question the frequency of gun violence in Japan and point out that it is extremely low. And for that reason, there's obviously a great deal of shock as a result of the assassination at the time and continues to be felt on the ground. I think, so David touched on the debate around politics and religion that has happened in the aftermath of the assassination. This is certainly not an issue that is confined to Japan, and we could have the same debate whether it's in the US or the UK, where people are based. But the framing does seem to be particularly poor in Japan. There is a sense that political parties in Japan need systematic and organized support. And that includes social movement groups, labor unions, human rights movements, and religious groups. In fact, the junior party in the ruling coalition is closely affiliated with a Buddhist religious group. And the sense that that this has almost been pushed front and center, and this question is very real to people at a time where I don't think the country was prepared to have this debate, is probably one of the reasons why there's still the deep sense of shock, but also a uncertainty about how to react, and also, a very difficult to find consensus in this area. So I suspect that we are going to see questions about whether there needs to be legislation in this area. Obviously, we've already had an inquiry conducted by Prime Minister Kishida, which highlighted a high association between the LDP and the Unification Church. I think maybe 50% of, or close to 50% of members had some affiliation with the Unification Church. So clearly there's a huge amount for this debate to run, and I think we will not really understand how much of an impact it will have for a number of years.
Govinda, thanks. I'm going to ask Professor Hirakawa, herself, of course, Japanese in Japan, for her thoughts on that and any other comments before turning to Chris Hughes for his thoughts.
Okay. Regarding the state funeral, what I found is that the Abe's traditional divisional structure just remained even for state funeral event. One of the reasons is, I think, Kishida's mismanagement, because Kishida did not explain well to the people, and also Congress never took the official process to decide the state funeral. So, but the point here is actually it was a very deja vu type political debate. So what Kishida could do is to integrate or unify Japanese divided people regarding Abe's politics by emphasizing anger for terrorism. Democracy should not be stopped by violence and violence or even terrorism, assassination. So we all Japanese share this feeling. But however, and in fact, I think perhaps it was a very good chance to unify Japanese people regarding the very unusual deaths of politicians beyond the difference of the political positions. but we lost it. We lost it. So Prime Minister Kishida was now perhaps he regret, but even frankly speaking, even after listening to his speech in the state funeral, still his real heart or frank comment are missing. I think it sounds like more very official writing prepared by bureaucrat. But in contrast, former Prime Minister Suga's speech was really, really appreciated, and many people were moved because Suga used his personal word, original way of thinking and writing, and he said very frankly by using his personal memories, which we didn't know until yesterday. So I think Prime Minister Kishida's way is very much business-like. So I think if only he appeared much more emotionally, honestly, the significance of state funeral, he could change the society's atmosphere more.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Chris, before I ask you to comment, I see we have got a couple of questions in the Q&A. Alex?
Yes, we got a few. So from an anonymous attendee, he was sort of looking to get a bit more of insight on the resistance by the younger generations about Abe's sort of, I guess, his persona.
Okay, let's take
Tobias, maybe.
Yeah, let's just take that. Yeah, Tobias, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I can take that quickly because I mean, paradoxically and maybe somewhat surprisingly, but if you look at opinion polls throughout his tenure and the breakdowns by demographics, his support was actually strongest among younger Japanese and was often worse. I think the worst bracket was usually those kind of nearing retirement and maybe sort of post 70, but sort of the younger demographics as a whole were actually quite supportive of him. And that might just reflect economic conditions. The fact that, if you were leaving school during the Abe years, there were more demand for labor than there had been in decades. And so I think, the labor market, really tight labor market, even if wages weren't necessarily rising as much as they wanted them to, times were good. And so actually, I mean, on the whole, I mean, we did see, I think, when periods where you had large protest marches and lots of activists in the street, you did see the young among them, but that's not necessarily representative of overall, I think, the attitudes you saw when it comes to the young as far as Abe is concerned.
Tobias, thanks. Chris, one minute just to sum up and reflect on what you've heard from this very, very interesting conversation, which I think has rather sort of stymied the Q&A because people have been given so much to think about. Yeah, they haven't asked us a lot of questions. But anyway, over to you quickly, and then I will.
Well, very briefly. I mean, I think it's I think Abe's death and the circumstances around it just demonstrates how consequential, influential, and complex his legacy has been. I mean, even with his passing, his influence is still there in terms of some of the domestic problems that he's left behind, and the whole unification church and how that's tripping up Kishida. So even with his passing, he's still very influential. I think the other interesting thing is, of course, he's a massively influential figure. I think he did create his own doctrine, but as we've talked about today, it's very mixed legacy, and there were some notable failures as well, and many contradictions in his influence. I was very struck by he's seen as a paragon of liberalism now externally, but as we've heard internally, many people question that, how liberal he really was and how illiberal he could be, and even externally. He talked about the rules-based international order, but he's very happy to, and universal values, but he's very happy to keep quiet on treatment of Uyghurs in China, what was going on in Myanmar, authoritarianism in Philippines. So a wonderfully influential figure, but also amazingly effective in influencing international opinion to take Japan seriously again as a big actor, but also being able to, in some cases, to mask many of the contradictions in his own doctrine. You can see that in history as well. Trying to escape from history, but actually becoming in some ways more bound up in problems of history in dealing with South Korea or trying to become more a bigger partner, a more equal partner of the United States, but in some ways becoming more dependent on the United States. So lots of contradictions and lots of things which will play out in the future. And we've yet to see, I think, the full consequences of Abe's doctrine and legacy. So it's really, really, really interesting topic. We could talk for hours potentially on this one.
Chris, we could, but we can't because we're running out of time. But what we're going to do is this recorded webinar will go out on YouTube. And I think when people have had time to reflect on the wise words they've heard on this panel, there will be a lot more interaction and people will pick it up from there. I think because a significant number of our panelists are Japanese and particularly polite, we haven't had as many questions perhaps as we would otherwise, and people will wish to reflect on what you've all said. So on behalf of the Age of Scotland Institute, I'm concluding this panel, which could not come at a more appropriate time, your input has been hugely helpful. I would like to, Tobias, thank you very much indeed. Again, a plug for your excellent book, which I have it here, although the writing is backwards. Look where you see it is. It's a very fine book, which I quoted from. Sir David, for bringing your wisdom and perspective to this scenario. One of the questions asked, not answered, is, are there some lessons in here for the United Kingdom in how to run its economy going forward? We have our own crises at the moment. Chris, to you for your input. Professor Hirakawa, thank you for the view with, again, the beautiful background from Japan. Thank you very much for that. And Govinda, thanks you for pushing and being the author of much of this panel, for all of your help on this from Japan, and Alex for holding the fort and marshalling the slightly non-existent Q&A, but we will deal with those at another time. So to all of you, thank you very much indeed. Have a great time, and for those of you, of course, in Japan, it's a great deal later than it is here. Still fairly early in the morning for Tobias and me, and afternoon for David and Chris. So to all of you, on behalf of the Age of Scotland Institute, thank you for a very excellent webinar. Thanks.